Hey guys, it's Brandon. Wanted to do a video, another master game video series after the British TV show from the 80s, of course. And I wanted to do a game from Fischer. We've already done one from Morphy and one from Kasparov and Karpov, and now I think we'll go on to a Fischer game. And this, of course, comes from the world famous championship match of 1972 with Fischer versus Spassky. And the game we're going to be going over is game number 10, which I think is a lesser known game. The most famous of the games being Game 3, which was Fischer's first win over Spassky, and Game 6, which was a really, really nice game. And at some point, I'll probably go over both of those in this video series also. But this game 10 is lesser viewed, and but it's still a pretty good game, I think. And I'd like to go over it. So Fischer playing white plays e4. We see e5 from Spassky, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. This is the Ruy Lopez. I'm no expert on Ruy Lopez theory, but I know a little bit, so I'll try to talk a little bit intelligently about it. a6, offering the knight for the bishop in exchange for the pawn structure. The idea is if white captures, then we have this messed up pawn structure for black, but in compensation, he gets this open b file and the bishop pair. So he'll try to use those advantages. I don't think it's theory for white to give up the bishop pair usually that quickly. More common is this move, bishop to a4, knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn. I think this is the Morphy defense right now, but actually this opening transposes into the closed Breyer variation, B-E-R-E-Y-E-R variation. So for those of you interested in the openings, that's the opening this transposes into. Castles. It's possible for the knight to capture on e4 here, but after something like rook to e1, and then either knight to c5 or knight to f3, bishop takes, white gets his pawn back and has better development, even though he's given up the bishop pair. And of course, all kinds of nasty threats, being that the rook is on the same line as the king here. So I don't think it's theory for the knight to take there. So after castles, what was played is bishop e7, rook to e1, protecting the e5 pawn, b5, bishop b3. It's not possible for black to win the bishop pair here. Well, I mean, it's possible, but after knight to b3, that leaves the e4 pawn undefended, and then it's just a free pawn for white. So you get the bishop pair, but down a pawn. So after b3, we see d6, and that's defending the e5 pawn. So now knight to b5 is an option. So that's why we see pretty standard move c3, giving the bishop a hideaway square. So this knight coming here wouldn't really be doing anything over here, because after knight b5 or a5, the bishop just comes away. And what's the knight really doing here on this a5 square? Oops. So castles is what Spassky plays. h3, a safety move, giving the king a hideaway square in case any rooks or the queen lands on the back rank. The king can always get in there. Also stopping knight g5 and bishop to, knight g4 and bishop to g4, pinning the knight, which may be annoying. So knight to b8. This is a pretty standard knight maneuver. Rerouting the knight to b7. d4. So this c3 d4 is also standard in the Ruy Lopez. This is the. I mean, it's in this game we're sort of going over all the Ruy Lopez theory that I actually know. So other than this, I really don't know much. So making a break in the center. If e takes and then c takes, so if something like this, we get white has these two nice pawns in the center, which at the right moment could move forward and be pain for black. So knight to d7, just completing the maneuver that he had set out before, from c6 to b8 to d7. Knight b to d2, standard knight maneuver, standard knight development, blocking in this dark square bishop for now, but that's one of the disadvantages of this sort of Ruy Lopez is that, and the disadvantages of the c3 move is that it takes away the best development square for the knight, thus forcing it to block in the bishop. So bishop b7, a nice diagonal for this bishop, just pointing down at the white king. Oops, that's not really a diagonal, but pointing down at the white king. And bishop c2, bringing the bishop back, rerouting it. A lot of bishop maneuvering goes on in the Ruy Lopez. Rook to e8, so this is all sort of standard moves, just sort of maneuvering around. b4, fixing this b pawn so that after bishop f8, he can play a4, so the pawn wouldn't be able to advance in this circumstance. A takes, interesting, A takes B takes A is possible, I think, but, and I'm not going to claim to know exactly. I think the idea is, if that's the case, then this A pawn becomes rather weak and could be targeted, just could become a target with moves like bishop d3, doubling on the A file, just putting pressure on it because it can't really advance forward because of the B pawn. Would just capture it and would be protecting it. It would be protected, so, I'm sure if you were to put it into a computer, it would say that's fine, but to me it just looks like an annoyance to take and have that isolated pawn, have that isolated pawn become a target on the H file, on the A file. So after A4 we saw knight B6, A5, closing up the queen side and kicking this knight back to D7. Now Spassky's only chance for counterplay where he has is to get in the C5 break at some point. That's the only pawn break he has left to him. So at some point Spassky will be playing that. Bishop D2, finally developing his last piece on this diagonal, pointing at the king, a fianchetto development. Queen to B8. Now this was a move that sort of had some depth associated with it. Spassky was planning the C5 break, and he wanted his queen to be on this diagonal so that he could capture eventually a knight that'll be taking here on E5, and we'll see how that develops in a second. Rook to B1, just covering this bishop. So C5, finally trying to find some counterplay with this C5 break. B takes C, D takes C. And now, of course, Fischer has a choice of either taking the C pawn or the E pawn, but I think he'd rather grab a center pawn because I think if this move here, this knight will recapture and just have a really nice square here on C5, hitting this pawn, putting pressure on this pawn, getting into all kinds of squares in the white position. So I think that's why we see D takes E, followed by knight takes, and now we see the point of this queen move, is so that once all these captures have happened, then queen takes E5, centralizing the queen on this nice square. Although it is sort of in line with this bishop, and that's why we see this move C4 from Fischer. Queen gets out of the way, and then bishop chops the knight, queen comes back, and pawn takes. And now it looks almost like Spassky has sacrificed a pawn because he plays rook to D8. So this pawn here on A6 could be taken. But Fischer's not really interested in pawn hunting. He plays queen to C1. And this is actually a very forward-thinking move. This queen he wants to end up here on F4, and we'll see why in a minute. After queen C3, putting pressure on the knight, knight has to move. It was the queen was also in a pin here on D8 with the rook pinning the knight to the queen. So it gets out of the pin, and now knight to F3, and we start to see Fischer's conception sort of coming into play. So Spassky now plays queen takes A5, getting his pawn back, and we see a pawn sacrifice from Fischer. This is actually, I don't know how far down the line Fischer saw when he played these moves, but I have a suspicion he saw just about this far down the line. And it's an awesome conception followed by an awesome tactics, and either Spassky missed it or decided to just play the position anyway. Bishop to B3. So putting this bishop back on the b file where it was before in the game, and putting pressure on this nice diagonal right to the king. And Fischer loves having the light square bishop on this diagonal as white. He oftentimes played the bishop c4 variation of the Sicilian defense as white, which is actually called the Fischer Sicilian variation. So it's a pawn sacrifice. So and not only that, it's two connected pass pawns on the queen side. Fischer's sacrificing those pawns for pressure on the a7 square. Excuse me, on the f7 square. So queen to f4, putting pressure on the f7 square, and the rook comes down to defend. Now knight to knight to e5, putting further pressure on it, and Spassky pins that knight to the queen, so it can't chop this rook right now. But now Fischer plays rook to d1, and it's important to note here that rook takes d1 is immediately losing because of bishop takes f7, and if king h8, then knight g6, followed by queen h4 is mate. So that's not possible, and from that point of view. And if queen takes f7, then queen takes f7, king h8, and regains the rook. So you're just down a queen for a rook, and that's why this rook takes d1 is not possible. So he plays the only move sort of to keep defense over the f7 square and hold on to this rook, because the rook can't really go here. That would take away all defense from the f7 square too. So rook to e7, maintaining defense on this square here, f7. Bishop takes f7. So this is an awesome tactic, which actually wins an exchange. And we'll see why in a second. After rook takes, queen takes f7, queen takes f7, knight takes f7. The point here is now that if king takes f7, rook d7 check wins back the piece because this bishop is undefended. So what actually happened in the game was after queen takes, knight takes, bishop takes e4, just getting a pawn at least before he loses this piece. And so now we have a circumstance where white is up in exchange, but black has these two dangerous passed pawns here on b5 and c5. So there's some play left for both sides. I think Spassky probably wasn't unhappy with it. I'm not sure if he saw this variation all the way. I mean, these guys were some of the best players ever, so maybe they did see this long variation where he gave up the exchange for these two passed pawns, and maybe he thought he could play for a win. I think at this point in the match, Fischer was leading by a couple games, and maybe he thought, better do something to try to play for a win here. And he probably thought that even if he didn't get a win, he could probably at least hold this endgame down the exchange because of these two pawns. So theoretically, I guess you could say, oh, actually, he's only up one pawn because there's a 3-2 over here on the king side, and but these two pawns are connected and they're passed. So I believe when I checked this with Houdini, it said that white the score was even at this point. But now an interesting part of the game, Fischer displays some awesome endgame technique, which leads to a win. Technique that I think the rest of us can only dream about. Rook takes d7 check. King comes towards the center. Rook to b7, attacking the b pawn. Now Spassky throws in a rook check and a bishop check, and then only then defends the b pawn, which was hanging, of course. So king to g2, improving the position of the king. h5, rook to b6, pinning this bishop and threatening it. And of course, it's not possible for the king to come over to defend because this rook cuts off the king's access on the e file. So he's forced to play rook to d1 to defend the bishop. King to f3, king f7 gets out of the pin. King to e2, attacking this rook. And the rook doesn't really have too many good squares to go to. If rook d4, then that would just be pretty bad. It would hang the bishop for one thing. So rook to d5. f4, sort of working to create his own pass pawn. Fischer has a 3-2 pawn majority here on the king side, so he's working now to create a pass pawn and just sort of restrain any possible activity of black. Also keeping the king out of these squares in the center. Important to note. g4, hg, hg, 8 g5, and now Fischer has a pass pawn here on the f-file to work with versus these two pass pawns. So getting to be an interesting endgame. Bishop e5, and now a move that actually wins a pawn. Rook to b5, pinning this pawn to this unprotected rook. And the rook, if it were to move, the idea is that if the rook were to move off of this file, off of this rank here, then the c pawn will just drop. So king f6, and now rook takes b4. Of course, if pawn takes, then this rook just hangs, and this pawn will fall pretty quickly. It'll be rounded up. So rook takes b4, and so now Spassky's down to even pawn material. Only one pawn for the exchange. That he got earlier. Actually, no pawns for the exchange that he got earlier. And Fischer has this pass pawn. So it's looking pretty grim for him at this point. And so rook to b6 check, king to e5, and king to f3. It's just very patient play by Fischer, keeping the king out of these two squares, not allowing him to come down into here and try to grab these pawns and maybe have some play here with this pass pawn. Just recognizing that his advantages are not going anywhere. They're not running away. This pawn's not going anywhere yet. This pawn here on c5. So he takes time just to say, okay, I'm going to just take away some counterplay from you. Rook to d8, and rook to b8, just offering some exchanges. Spassky doesn't want anything with that because, well, he's down so much material. Exchanging off a rook would be bad for him in this endgame. Maybe he's hoping for some kind of repeat there, but rook to g6, and there's really no way for him to hold on to this pawn. The bishop can't protect it, and because it would just be taken by the king. So pawn falls after king d5. So now Fischer himself has two pass pawns, so he's up an exchange and a pawn now with two connected pass pawns. And the game only lasts for a few more moves, but bishop to e5, f6. Okay, the bishop e5 move was attacking this rook, and Fischer plays f6, which is an awesome move because it first of all pins the bishop to the king, so it can no longer take, and it pushes this pawn one step closer to the queening square. King to d4, and after rook to b1, Spassky resigned. He'd had enough. The threat is, of course, rook to d1, check, winning the rook. And if he tries to prevent it somehow, say with, well, let's see, if he tries bishop f6, then rook to f5 is winning because the bishop now has to move, and once the bishop moves, there's no way to prevent this rook to d1 check. So actually, he'd have to sacrifice this bishop. And if this move, rook to f7, then just pawn to g6 wins the bishop because of the pin on the rook. Because of the pin on this rook here. So if pawn takes, then rook takes rook, and he's just down a whole rook, and it's pretty easily winning. Also, a possibility, I guess, it would be bishop d6, but this also doesn't work in the long run because of a rook d1 check. The king has to move out of the way, and then the bishop falls anyway because it's pinned to the rook, and now it's got two attackers on it. So the moral of the story is after rook to b1, with the threat of rook d1 and these two pass pawns, Spassky just resigned. So awesome endgame play, and just a great game, all around in general by Fischer. So hope you guys enjoyed that game, and we'll see you next time.